The period after Deltarune Chapter 1 was certainly an interesting time. After being given this extremely fascinating demo that followed up on Undertale, but in a different world and story, full of all these brand new concepts and mysteries, we just had to wait for when the rest of the game would be finished. It's been basically 3 years since Chapter 1 released, and we now barely have the second chapter of this game. During that time, I guess you can say development was going through some growing pains. Even if Toby Fox made Undertale, that was still just his first game. You can't have lightning in a bottle twice, especially since Deltarune is already becoming a much larger game than Undertale. Toby now has a proper team of developers alongside him for this project, and for 2 years, Toby has spent his time designing and planning for the whole game, and by May of 2020, the creation of Chapter 2 began properly as an engine for the game was finally settled on. Toby was looking into alternative engines after using GameMaker, but then decided to go back to using GameMaker. Still though, hurdles were had, such as Toby suffering from severe wrist and hand pains, to a point that he had to use voice to text for a period of time. A lot of the info I've stated is from the status updates written on the Deltarune website. I'll leave a link in the description if you want to read them yourself, which I highly recommend. You can really tell how much Toby cares about Deltarune in these posts. It's a much harder project than Undertale was, but he's determined to make this game a reality. I can only assume that the rest of the chapters won't take as long to release considering how much of these past 3 years has been spent on planning for the entire game as a whole, but it may still be a few years before we see Deltarune finished, which feels so surreal. Like, I understand the time it's taken for development, and I believe Toby and his team should take all the time they need, but if you know yourself about Deltarune, the inspiration for this game was first in 2012, still just a faint idea from Toby, but to see nearly a decade later, that glimmer of a game, while still not complete, is now shining brighter than it ever was, is really remarkable to me. The passage of time, man, it's so weird. Anyways, when we got that announcement for Chapter 2, I went frickin' nuts, dude. That happened right at the peak of my Deltarune high. Replaying Chapter 1 made me really excited to see where the game would go. I made a frickin' video talking about a full Deltarune fan comic series for crying out loud. Which, by the way, I would like to say that even though Chapter 2 is now here, I still love Paper Trail and I still stand by what I said in that video. I recommend you also watch that video, plus read the comic itself by link in the description. I played the ever-living heck out of Chapter 2, and now that it's been some time, I think my thoughts are clear enough to talk about it. How we're gonna do that though is a bit different from our last look into Deltarune. There are some really deep and insightful aspects of Chapter 2 that I want to dig into and get my own spin on analyzing. While Deltarune on the surface is still a very lighthearted and silly game, the extra layers beneath that surface show themes and plot points that highlight what Deltarune is really capable of. So without further ado, let's begin. I think I should first make clear what my general thoughts on Chapter 2 are. I absolutely love it! It's a major step up from Chapter 1 in a number of ways, and properly establishes the structure for Deltarune. Having a central town as your hub that seemingly expands throughout the chapters is brilliant, and I really appreciate the gameplay improvements from this chapter. Allowing your other teammates to also do acts and giving Mercy its own percentage meter were such smart moves. The former makes it so that your teammates are always able to contribute to sparing an enemy beyond being used in Kris's turn, and the latter gives this feeling that you're chipping away at an enemy while having a reference for how long you have to do that for certain acts. Both of these together lead to faster fights in Chapter 1 that hold a greater interest. There's also a good reason to encounter enemies now, as sparing enough of an enemy type will add them to your town. Undertale made its battles random encounters, so that you couldn't avoid facing enemies along your journey, but Chapter 1 of Deltarune had enemies beyond the map, and considering you don't actually grow from battles, there is really nothing stopping you from trying to avoid enemies. Now there's a proper incentive to fight enemies, but in a way that doesn't feel like you have to grind EXP. You spare enough of an enemy type, and then you move on. Enemies as a whole have been made much more interesting in Chapter 2 as well. The attack patterns have been made much trickier, and there's more in-depth mechanics to sparing enemies than Chapter 1. Even if sparing an enemy is just a matter of hitting a single act, it goes by much quicker from allowing Susie and Ralsei to also act, plus there's even more charm to it than Chapter 1. Like, come on, look at those outfits! The bosses are definitely where all these mechanics come together. You remember how sparing Jevil was this process of continually doing an act while managing the well-being of your whole party? That's now the standard for boss fights. You'll have to continually act in order to chip away at a boss's percentage, with a higher amount being done if you use all your teammates for a turn, all the while making sure you're not hurt too badly from attacks in order to keep using acts. It's such a satisfying risk and reward system for fights that keeps attention high while giving you an active goal to reach for, instead of simply surviving waves of attacks. The presentation is the best it's ever been for Toby's games. The OST is still full of absolute bangers. Hearing the theme of Cyberworld drop as you begin exploring the area was a magical feeling. It made me fully process, wow, I'm playing Deltarune Chapter 2. The cyber world is so vibrant, from the green fields at the beginning to the Queen's Palace at the end. I love seeing all these locations. The theming of the internet and computers is so dang cool, and leads to such fun and creative designs for all the characters in this chapter. Fun is simply the purest way to describe so many of the character interactions. Chapter 1 was really funny, but Chapter 2 makes Deltarune one of the funniest games I've ever played. There were so many jokes that constantly made me burst into laughter. Even now, some gags still get me due to their absurdity. Both Queen and Burly have got to be some of the funniest characters Toby has ever written. Queen is full of this insane energy that still manages to feel unique while not relying too much on standard internet humor. And Burly is one of those characters that you love to hate, but then kind of unironically love over time. He's so dang full of himself and in his own world, putting on this hilarious act of superiority until he goes the complete opposite direction by the end, with a comedic twist that I never saw coming. This might as well be the biggest plot twist Deltarune ever has. Susie as well became a character I love even more in Chapter 2. It's cool seeing her as a reliable friend that may still throw out the insults every now and then, but still clearly cares about others. Like, she does genuinely feel like your friend, and shows it in different ways. She's just one of the best characters in Deltarune, alright? This is all not even including the fact that the final boss of this chapter is frickin' Punch-Out, as you make a mech out of that stupid device you made in Chapter 1. Like, look at this! I am a Power Rangers-esque mech with a duck head, as I play Punch-Out with a literal embodiment of internet trollage. It's so stupid and utterly ridiculous, and that's why I love it so much. You can tell the game knows how ridiculous and dumb it is, but it doesn't care. It doesn't need to constantly wink its eye at you and be overly self-aware. It is confident with how absurd this chapter is, but it's even more confident with how dark and serious it gets. I wanted to first talk about the specific pros of Chapter 2, because this is all what can easily be seen on a first playthrough, but it's when you start to analyze elements of the game, dialogue said, and secrets you can uncover, that you really start to appreciate all of what Chapter 2 does, which is why it's time to start analyzing those elements. I didn't really talk about them much in the Chapter 1 video, but hands down the most fascinating character in Deltarune to me is Kris. I feel like I've introduced Kris like this before. Never mind. Now, when I say that in this video game, the player controls Kris, that sounds like a very normal statement, right? Well, Deltarune seemingly takes that very literally. In Deltarune, you, the player, are an actual being that has some, existence in this world that controls Kris's actions against their will. You do this through the soul that's tied to them, which is the heart that, that you play the game with. That may have sounded a bit confusing, so let's elaborate on that. There are a number of times where you're given a choice of what to do or say, pretty much the standard dialogue options that come with a silent protagonist, but with Kris, there'll usually be some sort of reaction that they have with what they say, or what happens is illogical to their character, as if they don't have control over what they say or do. If you choose to say that Kris wants to go with Ralsei at the carnival, Kris will say it in a very confused way. If you say that Kris is okay during this one part, Kris says it in a very strained manner, like they want to say no, but are forcibly saying yes. If you try to play the piano in the hospital, you can barely play a note, which makes Kris upset, since it's established that they have a history with learning the piano. If we say that it's great to see Sans again in Chapter 1, well, that just makes no sense to Kris's character, since they've never actually met Sans, and Sans acknowledges this himself. Even in this chapter, you can go to the register and say you want to buy things, but realistically, that's not how stores like this work. A person doesn't just go up to the register to buy things, but that's exactly how players were taught how to buy things in RPGs. You see what I'm getting at here? It's not as if Kris does nothing on their own, but the player acts as this force controlling their actions, forcing them to do things they wouldn't normally do. Kris wouldn't get off this button as Noelle is walking by an electric barrier, but hey, I'm controlling them so I make them pull this prank on Noelle, and when she gets back at us, Kris looks hurt because I don't think they want to do that to Noelle, but we make them do it regardless. The best way to describe it is that Kris is like a puppet, and we're the ones pulling their strings, and I literally just described the theme of this chapter, sorry boss, didn't I? For our most memed character of this chapter, we have Spamton G. Spamton, an embodiment of internet scams and a salesman who goes on about giving you a deal that'll make you a big shot, all the while he is living in a dumpster, rotting away. His bizarre speech patterns and really strange personality and theme already made him very memorable, but he also serves as our secret boss. The hurdles to unlock this part aren't complicated, but once you do them, Spamton becomes this thing, known as Spamton Neo. He's achieved this new form in order to gain what he calls freedom, which alongside Jevil, seems to be the running theme behind each super boss. He still has yet to achieve freedom though, as he's now tied to these puppet strings, preventing him from true freedom. He wants our soul as a result, which leads into a fight, and it's by far my favorite fight in Deltarune thus far. It's easier than Jevil for me, but the shooting mechanic from Undertale returns, but now horizontally. The track that plays is my favorite boss theme, and it's an interesting challenge using your team to repeatedly snap his strings until they're completely gone. You free Spamton from his puppet strings, and it seems like a great moment for him, until this renders him lifeless and unable to function now that the strings are gone. It's weirdly sad, as he says maybe we can break free from our own strings. This encounter ends up really getting to Kris, and I think that's reflective of their own state. They too are tied to strings that prevent them from freedom, and what happens to Spamton here makes me wonder what would happen to Kris if their connection to the soul was severed. Would they too suffer a similar fate to Spamton? Kris does have a background of being their own character though. I already said that they have a history with the piano, but it seems like they were also a bit of a prankster when they were younger. They hid under the bed to scare Noelle, and pretended that they were bleeding to also scare her. They also apparently committed a number of sins, like dropping a lizard in a pit in a video game, so Asriel would beg for forgiveness on Kris's behalf, which, okay, that was pretty funny. There's also the thing with the different character teas. Okay, so to quickly break this down, there are tea healing items based on each character that heal a party member based on how they feel about the character it's based on. For example, Noelle has a massive crush on Susie, so the Susie tea would heal her by 400 points, and it seems each character doesn't think the highest of themselves, as drinking their own tea only heals like 10 health. For Kris, we can see that drinking Susie's tea is a max heal for them, showing that they really like Susie. Dang, every other kid really likes Susie, huh? Drinking Ralsei's tea, however, heals an average amount of health, suggesting that they kinda have meh feelings towards Ralsei, which is pretty interesting to think about on its own. It's highlighted how Kris does miss their brother since he's still at college. You could tell from stuff like their search history, including when college vacation would be, so essentially when Asriel would be coming back. With all the connections Ralsei has to Asriel, from looks and name, perhaps Kris is mixed on how he resembles their brother, a sibling that means a lot to them. Like, no matter the person, I'd be off-put if they resemble someone I care about with no explanation as to why. This is also based on my personal belief that Ralsei is not actually Asriel, but must have some sort of connection. For how I'd personally interpret Kris's character, they were a pretty prankish kid who had a good relationship with their brother. They're also seen as the weird kid who may now be a bit antisocial, but still enjoys being around people like Susie, perhaps because she's so rebellious and admires that now considering their controlled state. Their soul is something that they resent and wish to be free from, but there may be another force controlling them for all we know. There's a lot of ways you can interpret Kris, and maybe all I've said about them is nothing original, but I do love seeing all the small details to take into account with Kris. Compared to Frisk and Undertale, Kris has an established relationship and history with a number of characters in this game from the start, including being childhood friends with another big focus of this chapter, Noelle. Noelle was more of a minor character in Chapter 1, but in Chapter 2, she's one of the biggest focuses, since she and Burley end up in the Dark World, and she becomes your party member for a period of time. It was so damn cool having her tag alongside you for the city section, and you get some really good insight into her character. She's not as over the top as other characters in this chapter like Burley and Queen, so reacts differently to a lot of the weird events in this chapter. Your time with her is a great way of grounding the story. It was shown how she has a crush on Susie in Chapter 1, but now it's super highlighted in Chapter 2. Listen man, she just wants to get somewhere with her, but Susie is comedically oblivious to this fact. Will they ever become a thing at some point in this game? Yeah, maybe, I don't know, I'm not the writer. But it's a good aspect of Noelle's character, and actually says something interesting about her. She says Susie is a good kind of scary, which is something she likes about her. It's most highlighted in this quiet scene in the city, but Noelle talks about how she didn't mind being afraid if it meant people were there to comfort her, to essentially know that she's not alone in this feeling of darkness. Now this may be a bit of a stretch on my part, but I feel like that kinda thematically ties in with the song Don't Forget, in terms of the idea of being comforted in a dark place. This scene in general is probably my favorite part of Chapter 2 for how it tonally shifts into a more serious mood in a smooth way that doesn't clash with everything else in this chapter. It's this small break where Kris and Noelle get to reflect on their past relations. The fact that they're basically childhood friends that strayed away from each other over time is really cool to me. There's a backstory there we have yet to know everything about, and we get mentions of Noelle's older sister Des. We still know very little about her, but Noelle having an older sister is a good parallel to Kris, who has Azrael as an older brother, so it seems that they were all a group of friends growing up, but I guess things changed over time. We know Azrael is supposedly in college, but we don't really know what happened to Des. The only theory I personally latch onto is that maybe something not great happened to Des. If we go by the idea that Des is the shortened version of December, it would add context as to why Noelle couldn't spell December in Burley's backstory. Heck, during the scene where Des is first mentioned, the word December is being spelled, an association that would have frozen up Noelle, assuming something happened to Des. I don't want to immediately claim that she's dead, but with how Noelle talks about Des, it really feels like they're implying she's no longer with them. Add this up with how her dad is in the hospital and the not so great relationship she has with her mom, this girl is burdened with so many family troubles that are quietly tragic amidst all the comedic moments in chapter 2. Noelle has risen into being one of my favorite characters in Deltarune so far. She feels like another very fresh character between both of Toby's games, and I really hope her focus in Deltarune doesn't just stop at chapter 2. I want to see her character be even more realized in the rest of the chapters, and to learn more about her and Kris's past. You can drop Burley's focus after chapter 2 though. We already had a good time with him in this chapter, but depending on how you do this chapter, you may be able to make sure he isn't in the rest of the game. In chapter 1 of Deltarune, there was no genocide route or any sort of alternate route you could take. Whether you attacked every enemy or spared them all, only some minor changes were had. For chapter 2 however, we got our alternate route, in what fans are calling the Snowgrave Route. The way of unlocking it is a little different than just attacking every enemy you come across. You're able to start this route once Noelle joins your party. You see, your main party is never actually capable of killing any enemies you fight, since they always run away. But Noelle has a little move called Ice Shock. This is a damage dealer that freezes enemies and, yep, you can actually kill them now. They're now just on the overworld as they are frozen solid. To continue this route, you have to make Noelle kill every single enemy in this part of the chapter. Eventually, the enemies start running away from you too. They start to catch on the kind of monster you are. Heck, even the music starts to change. Noelle isn't oblivious of what's happening either. She notices how strange Kris is becoming. Or should I say, how strange you, the player, are making Kris. Their dialogue becomes really cryptic and creepy too, as you force Noelle to do things like murder this guy for his ring, or force her to do things she really doesn't feel comfortable with. What you do to Noelle in this route is really unsettling. You're essentially corrupting her into becoming a mass murderer, as she starts to grow used to it as well. Instead of being shocked whenever a battle begins, she starts acting prepared. You hear her thoughts multiple times as she slowly accepts what is happening, all for the sake of getting stronger, she says. Chapter 1 pushed the idea that your choices don't matter, but I think what this actually means is that Kris's own actions and choices are the ones being held back. They aren't given a choice on what to do with themselves, since you're the one controlling them. Just like how the player manipulates Kris's actions, you manipulate Noelle's actions. Noelle has shown to be a character who isn't great at being assertive. Defenseless is what her dad calls her too. She goes along with what others say and has a hard time standing up for herself until the end of the chapter, where she finds the strength to be more confident in herself. It's a nice arc for her character that also plays into themes of control and freedom for oneself, which has been a constant theme for Deltarune that's seen all throughout the game in so many ways. She still acts less defenseless by the end of this route, but it feels like it happened in a much dirtier way. You took advantage of that timid nature she's grown to have, forcibly pushing the idea that this is what she's supposed to do. She's supposed to proceed with what's happening, which leads to her completely freezing Burley alive, with the move that people have named this route after, Snowgrave. Is he actually dead or only in a coma? We don't know yet, but hey, you can fit a large person in that closet. Who's to say you can't fit Burley's body inside either? Perhaps it can be argued that this route isn't as dark as murdering a whole civilization of people like in Undertale, but what happens here feels very personal, and we have no idea how this is going to play into future chapters. It's possible future chapters may also have alternate routes like this. The presence of the player becomes even more obvious in this route. Noelle talks to herself about how Kris has been recently acting different, so we can assume that our control over Kris is a recent thing. Could have been right when Deltarune started. Even Toriel has been lately concerned about Kris, so people are starting to catch on to their strange behaviors. Noelle says the voice that was directing her was unlike Kris's, a voice that was terrifying but didn't belong to them. Essentially, the voice of a player controlling the actions of these characters, and if you want to see even more proof of this, we can see it in this Route Spamton fight. Instead of Queen, the final boss of the Snowgrave Route is Spamton Neo, but you only have Kris as the single party member, so the fight is much harder. Once you make it to the end, Spamton's last resort is making his defense so high that he's basically impossible to kill. The only thing you can do are the single acts that you're given. First, Kris calls Ralsei for help, but nobody came. Kris calls Susie for help, but nobody came. But finally, for the last act available, you whispered Noelle's name. Not Kris. The text doesn't specify Kris like the previous acts. It specified that you, the player, were the one that whispered to Noelle, the voice that she listens to, and as a result, finishes the fight as she casts Snowgrave one final time. The Snowgrave Route is so tonally different from the main route, but it doesn't at all feel like a different game. This all still falls in line and expands upon the ideas that Deltarune Chapter 1 had. The fact that this is the same game where you play mechanized Punch-Out with a robot that has a duck for a head, but still takes seriously all the dark stuff that happens in this route, shows how much range Deltarune has as a game. How seamlessly it can switch tones. How confident it is, from furthering the fourth wall breaking concepts of Undertale in its own unique way. How determined it is at being something great. Despite how long this video has gone on, there's still so much I could discuss in depth. I could go even further into all the changes that happened on your second day in the town. I could talk more about all the side characters. I can mention that awkward moment that takes place in Sansa's shop, but there's only a bit left that I want to discuss in depth. I've seen a bit of discussion lately on how people are suspicious of Ralsei's character. Even as someone who loves him, I do believe he is holding back info from us and knows more than he lets on. There's bound to be a legitimate connection to him and Azrael. There's no way that this is just a coincidence. I don't think he's a villain or anything like that. Some of the things that happen with him can be perceived as a bit strange or feel like a toxic kind of positivity, but I can see that as being a flaw with him as a person. Could it be an act? Sure, but I don't think it would be for a malevolent reason. I sincerely doubt there's going to be a twist that he was the villain all along, mostly because that would honestly be such a lame twist and direction to take his character for me. I'd like to believe Toby wouldn't make one of his main characters in Deltarune into a twist villain for the sake of catching the audience by surprise. It's just a direction for the writing that I don't see as good. The most interesting part to come from Ralsei's character in this chapter is when he actually gets serious at the end, when he explains the dangers of opening more dark fountains. We were told some sort of calamity would occur if the harmony between light and dark was disrupted in Chapter 1, but in Chapter 2, we know more about what would actually happen. Ralsei now calls it the Roaring. We learn that this calamity would awaken these mysterious titans that would destroy the world, and all the Darkners will be turned into statues, just like what happened to Lancer when he entered a different dark world, leaving all the Lightners to defend themselves alone. This is definitely one of the most serious moments in this chapter, excluding the Snowgrave Route, and I think it's going to foreshadow aspects of the next few chapters. I still feel like there's more prophecy and legend stuff Ralsei knows, and we'll likely learn a bit more each chapter until the full story between the light and dark is fully revealed to us. We may also be getting closer to reaching this calamity as the chapters go on too. Some sort of disaster must be occurring at some point in this story if they're continually building up to the supposed calamity. The ending of this chapter may also be hinting at this. Now personally, I don't think Kris is this knight that keeps getting mentioned in the game. That's way too obvious of an answer to give in only Chapter 2. But that doesn't change how awesome of a cliffhanger this final scene is. The ending of Chapter 1 was already cool for how it created this mystery behind Kris, but Chapter 2 plays on the knowledge you've been given up to this point. When you see Kris stab that knife into the ground, you completely understand what's happening and what it can mean for future chapters in this game. Kris, and possibly another party, are creating dark fountains around the town, creating the locations for each of these chapters, and building up to what are hopefully insane revelations. Please make the bunker be the last Dark World location. That will be the sickest thing ever and make this game the greatest game ever. Please, Toby, I swear to God, I wanted that. I could ramble on even longer about all the details this chapter holds, but I think you get the point already. While we still only have 2 chapters, I already love Deltarune a lot, and it's looking to be an incredible video game once it's all done. It will still take a lot to top Undertale for me, but I'm now completely confident that Deltarune has the potential to do just that. Heck, it has the potential to be one of my favorite games alongside Undertale. There's a unique feeling to Toby's games that make me adore them in a way that no other game can really replicate. An emotional attachment that goes beyond, this is a great video game, and becomes a video game that means something personal to me and my life. I've given quite a number of what ifs in this video. Some theories, some predictions, some vague guesses. But if there are 3 things I'm absolutely certain about, it's that I love Undertale, I love Deltarune, and I'm just so excited to see Deltarune be complete. Until next time. Well, that seems like a good place to call it for this video. If you enjoyed your time at all, subscribing, liking, all that junk would be very appreciated. It would also be cool if you left your own thoughts on Deltarune, or anything I specifically talked about, in the comments. I really love talking about this game if it wasn't obvious enough. I've also made a handful of other video essays on Undertale and Deltarune in the past if you want to check those out. This is really the last big video I want to do for now on Deltarune, but don't worry, I plan on eventually returning back to this topic. With all that said, thank you so much for watching, and have a good day.